It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. After months of stressful work, our getaway to the Amalfi Coast was meant to rekindle the fire in our marriage. Sophie, my wife of 6 years, had planned every detail: the quaint villa overlooking the Mediterranean, the dinners under the stars, and the days spent wandering through sun-dappled streets. I had no reason to doubt her sincerity, or so I thought. The first few days were magical. We laughed like we hadn't in months, shared wine over candlelit meals, and even left our phones off, a rare victory in the age of constant connectivity. Sophie had always been the planner, and this trip was no exception. She mapped out every outing with her signature enthusiasm. But on the fourth night, the cracks began to show. She became distracted, her usual attentiveness replaced by a strange detachment. I'd catch her glancing at her phone with an urgency she tried to mask. "Work emails," she explained with a sheepish smile. I didn't question it at first. Sophie was a dedicated professional. Her work had always been a priority. But the shadow that crossed her face told another story. The next day, as we strolled through the vibrant Positano market, Sophie's phone buzzed incessantly. She excused herself, claiming she needed to take a call about an urgent client matter. I waited near a stall selling handcrafted jewelry, pretending not to notice her hushed tones as she stepped away. When she returned, her mood had shifted again. Forced cheerfulness that felt more like an act than genuine joy. That evening, she suggested we explore the town separately. "You've been talking about visiting that historic church," she said with a tone too casual to be innocent. "I want to check out the local art gallery. We'll meet back at the villa." I hesitated but agreed. Her suggestion made sense on the surface. She'd always loved art, and I'd been keen on the cathedral's famed mosaics. Yet, as I watched her walk away, that gnawing feeling of unease settled deeper in my chest. Something wasn't right. At the church, my mind wandered. Instead of marveling at the intricate craftsmanship, I found myself replaying Sophie's recent behavior. The furtive glances at her phone, the sudden mood swings, the inexplicable distance between us. I tried to shake it off. Perhaps I was being paranoid, overanalyzing the actions of a woman I'd known and loved for years. But when I returned to the villa that night, Sophie wasn't there. When I walked into the villa, the silence was deafening. The sun had long set, casting long shadows across the room. Sophie's belongings were still neatly arranged by the bed, her jacket draped over the chair where she had tossed it that morning. But she was nowhere to be found. I checked my watch. It was close to midnight. She had promised to be back by dinner time. I tried calling her, but the line went straight to voicemail. At first, I convinced myself that she had simply lost track of time, engrossed in the gallery's offerings. That was Sophie, always diving headfirst into what she loved. But as the minutes ticked by, doubt began to creep in. An hour later, her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. She'd left it behind. My gut twisted. Sophie never went anywhere without her phone. I picked it up, feeling a wave of unease as I stared at the locked screen. A string of notifications illuminated the display, text from an unsaved number. My thumb hovered over the screen, torn between respecting her privacy and confronting the growing storm of suspicion in my chest. The decision was made for me when the phone buzzed again. Another message flashed across the screen. "Can't wait for tonight. Meet you at the pier." My heart sank. I stared at the message, replaying its meaning over and over in my head. It could be innocent, I whispered to myself, but the more I tried to rationalize it, the harder it became to believe. A meeting at the pier at this hour? Who would text her like this, without a name, just a number? And why had she left without her phone? The villa suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in around me. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the cool night air. The town had mostly gone to sleep, the streets quiet save for the sound of waves lapping against the shore. I made my way toward the pier, unsure of what I was looking for, or if I even wanted to find it. As I approached the dock, the scene came into view. A small, secluded corner where the light of the moon cast long reflections on the water. And there she was, Sophie, standing at the edge of the pier. She wasn't alone. A man was with her. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impossibly confident as he leaned in close, speaking in hushed tones that I couldn't make out. Sophie laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. It was light, carefree, and devastatingly familiar. My chest tightened. That laugh was mine. It was supposed to be mine. They didn't notice me at first. Hidden by the shadows of the alley, I watched as the man reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Sophie's face. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, her expression soft and open in a way I hadn't seen in months. My vision blurred. Time seemed to slow, the sound of the waves fading into the background. This couldn't be real. Not Sophie. Not my Sophie. Suddenly, Sophie turned her head, as if sensing she was being watched. Her eyes met mine, and her face fell. The man followed her gaze, his brow furrowing as he took a step back. For a long moment, none of us moved. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. She tried to speak, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked away, my mind reeling. Each step felt heavier than the last as I made my way back to the villa. The questions swirled like a storm. Who was that man? How long had this been going on? Why didn't I see it sooner? By the time I reached the villa, I was numb. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had promised my life to, had betrayed me. My love, my trust, my faith in her. It all felt like a cruel joke. But even as the anger bubbled beneath the surface, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The villa was dark when I returned, save for the soft glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as if it could hold back the flood of emotions threatening to consume me. My mind raced, but one thought burned brighter than the rest. I needed answers. Sophie hadn't followed me back. Not yet, at least. I paced the room, each step echoing in the stillness. My eyes fell on her phone, still lying on the counter. The message from the unknown number flashed again, the words a cruel taunt. With trembling hands, I unlocked the device. She hadn't changed the passcode. Birthdays were her habit. This time, it worked against her. The text thread unraveled before me, a series of exchanges that painted a picture more damning than I was prepared for. Flirty messages, plans for secret meetings, and even photos. My stomach churned as I scrolled further. They'd been meeting for weeks, months, maybe. My mind reeled as I pieced together the timeline. Trips she claimed were for work. Late nights she chalked up to dinner with colleagues. Lies upon lies. I wanted to throw the phone, to shatter it against the wall, but something held me back. This wasn't just betrayal, this was evidence. Evidence of the life she'd been leading behind my back. The sound of the door opening snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned to see Sophie standing in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. She closed the door quietly, her eyes darting toward me before settling on the phone in my hand. The silence between us was suffocating. "I can explain," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't." My voice was sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "Don't insult me with excuses, Sophie. I saw you." Her eyes widened, tears brimming as she stepped closer. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I laughed bitterly, cutting her off. "Then tell me, Sophie, what is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around with some guy while I've been breaking my back trying to make this trip perfect for us." She flinched, her expression crumbling. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake." "Don't you dare call this a mistake," I growled, my anger bubbling to the surface. "A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. This is betrayal. You didn't trip and fall into his arms, Sophie. You made a choice." Her tears spilled over, but they did little to soften the rage burning inside me. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I was just—" "Stop." I held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't want to hear it. Not tonight." I turned away, needing space to think, to breathe. But before I could retreat to the bedroom, her voice stopped me. "Please," she said, her words desperate. "Let me explain. Let me make this right." I looked at her, my heart a war zone of love and hate, hope and despair. The woman standing before me was both a stranger and the person I had once vowed to spend my life with. But right now, I couldn't reconcile those two realities. "I don't know if you can," I said finally, my voice hollow. But tomorrow we'll talk. Tonight, I need to be alone. Sophie nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, she retreated to the guest room, leaving me alone in the darkened villa. I sank into the couch, staring at the phone in my hand. The messages were still there, glaring reminders of her betrayal. As the hours stretched on, a plan began to take shape. If Sophie thought she could play me for a fool, she was wrong. This wasn't just about understanding what had happened. It was about taking back control. For too long, I had been blind to the cracks in our relationship. That ended now. When the sun rose the next day, I would have a clearer head and a strategy. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sunrise cast a golden glow over the villa, its warmth at odds with the icy knot in my chest. I hadn't slept. How could I? The images and words from Sophie's texts replayed in my mind like a relentless nightmare. Every message, every secret plan was a crack in the foundation of the life I thought we had built together. Sophie was still in the guest room. I could hear her muffled sobs through the thin walls. A part of me wanted to burst in, to demand answers and scream until the truth spilled out of her. But another part, the part that was growing stronger by the hour, wanted to be smarter than that. Cooler. Calculating. I needed the full picture. Confronting her now would only give her the chance to twist the story, to weave a narrative where she was the victim of circumstance. No, I couldn't allow that. I needed to know every detail before I made my move. I grabbed her phone again, this time diving deeper into her digital life. Emails, photos, even her search history. It was all there, a breadcrumb trail of her deceit. I found receipts for dinners and hotel stays, all from times she claimed to be working late. There were photos of them together, candid and carefree, like a couple deeply in love. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep looking. Then I found the messages that shifted everything. After this trip, we'll figure out a way to tell him. He deserves to know the truth. It was from him, Darren, a name that now burned into my mind like a brand. The message was dated 2 days ago, just before we left for the Amalfi Coast. Another message followed. Just one last night, sophomore. Then it's us. No more secrets. My hands trembled as I pieced it together. This wasn't just an affair. It was a plan to leave me, to dismantle our life and build a new one with him. My mind raced with the implications. Was this trip a cover for her to say goodbye? Or was it meant to soften the blow when she finally told me the truth? My heart pounded, the anger simmering beneath my skin threatening to boil over. But I couldn't let it consume me. Not yet. If they thought I was some naive husband who would quietly accept this betrayal, they were wrong. I was done being the fool. I decided to act. Opening Sophie's email, I sent a message to Darren from her account. Meet me tonight. The usual place. It was simple but effective. He'd think it was her, and I would finally have the opportunity to face him, to confront the man who had been tearing my life apart behind my back. I placed the phone back on the counter and took a deep breath. Sophie had stirred by now, her footsteps soft as she moved around the villa. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. When she emerged, her eyes were red and swollen, her expression one of quiet desperation. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, the silence between us a heavy barrier. "I know I've hurt you," she began, her hands wringing nervously. "And I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. But please, let me try to explain." I looked at her then, really looked at her. She seemed smaller somehow, the confident woman I had fallen in love with reduced to a shadow of herself. But I couldn't afford to pity her. "Not now. Not yet," I said firmly, my voice cold. "There's still more I need to understand." She hesitated, her lips trembling as she nodded. "Okay, I'll give you time." Time. That was all I needed. Tonight, when Darren showed up expecting her, he'd get me instead. And Sophie? She would see exactly who she had underestimated. As the day dragged on, Sophie tried to bridge the gap between us, offering small gestures of kindness. Coffee refills, a timid smile, even a hand on my arm. But I remained distant, my focus on the confrontation ahead. By the time night fell, I was ready. Darren would walk into the trap, and I would have the answers I needed. More importantly, I would have my revenge. The clock ticked closer to midnight, each second dragging longer than the last. Sophie had retired to the guest room again, her attempt to reconcile thwarted by my cold silence. She knew something was coming. My demeanor must have made that clear, but she didn't press. Whether it was guilt or fear, I couldn't tell, and I didn't care. Her betrayal had dulled my empathy. I stood by the window, staring at the moonlit path that led to the pier. The text I'd sent from Sophie's phone sat unanswered until early evening, when Darren replied. Of course. Midnight. See you there. A chill ran through me, but not from fear. It was anticipation. My blood burned with a mix of anger and resolve, fueling every step as I left the villa. I didn't bother telling Sophie where I was going. She wouldn't have asked anyway. The pier was deserted, the gentle lapping of waves the only sound in the crisp night air. I found a shadowed spot near a stack of crates, where I could remain unseen until the moment was right. My heart pounded as I waited, the weight of what I was about to do pressing down on me. But there was no turning back. At precisely midnight, I heard footsteps. A tall figure approached from the far end of the dock, his posture confident and his movements unhurried. Darren. Even in the dim light, I recognized him from the photos on Sophie's phone. He had the easy charm of a man who had taken what wasn't his without remorse. That smugness ignited something primal in me. He stopped near the edge of the pier, looking around expectantly. Sophie, he called out softly, his voice carrying over the water. I stepped out of the shadows. His head snapped toward me, confusion flashing across his face. You're not? No, I interrupted, my voice cold. I'm not Sophie. He hesitated, his confidence faltering as he took a step back. Look, I don't know what you think this is. I think this is you trying to steal my wife. I cut him off, my fists clenching at my sides. I think this is you destroying the life I built while pretending you're a good guy. Darren raised his hands defensively, his expression shifting to one of cautious calm. All right, let's talk about this like adults. I'm not here to cause trouble. You're not? I scoffed, taking a step closer. You've been sneaking around with my wife for months, lying to my face, and I'm supposed to believe you're not here to cause trouble? He didn't reply. He was gauging me, probably deciding whether to run or try to talk his way out of it. I didn't give him the chance. You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you? I continued, my voice rising. You thought I'd just sit back while you and Sophie made plans to destroy my life. Darren shifted uncomfortably. Look, man, this isn't just about you. Sophie's not happy. She hasn't been for a long time. The words hit like a punch to the gut, but I refused to show it. That's the excuse you tell yourself to make this okay? I stepped closer, my voice trembling with anger. You don't get to decide what she's feeling, and you sure as hell don't get to play the hero in this story. Darren's confidence wavered, and he took another step back, his heels hovering dangerously close to the edge of the pier. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he said quickly. It just happened. You didn't mean for it to get this far? I repeated, my voice cold. Funny, because it looks like you had a pretty clear plan. Before he could respond, I lunged forward, grabbing the front of his shirt. He staggered, his arms flailing to regain balance as I shoved him against the railing. For a moment, he looked genuinely afraid. Please, he stammered. I didn't want to hurt you. But you did, I growled, my face inches from his. And now you're going to feel what that's like. I let go of his shirt abruptly, and he stumbled back. He tripped over the edge of the pier and fell into the water with a loud splash. Darren thrashed, coughing and sputtering as he struggled to find his footing in the shallow water. I stood above him, staring down with a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. Stay away from my wife, I said coldly, my voice cutting through the night. And if I ever see you again, you'll regret it. Without waiting for a reply, I turned and walked away, leaving him floundering in the dark water. My heart pounded as I made my way back to the villa. This wasn't over, not yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of control. When I reached the villa, Sophie was waiting in the living room. She looked up as I entered, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Where were you?" she asked hesitantly. I didn't answer. Instead, I met her gaze with a calm that hid the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, "we're going to talk. And you're going to tell me everything." The morning sun streamed through the windows of the villa, casting a warmth that felt cruelly indifferent to the storm brewing inside. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. She had barely touched it. Her eyes were red, her expression somber. I stood across from her, my arms crossed, the air between us charged with tension. "Talk," I said, breaking the silence. She flinched at the sharpness in my voice, but to her credit, she didn't shy away. Instead, she took a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she set the mug down. "I never meant for this to happen," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't plan it." "Stop," I interrupted, my patience already wearing thin. "Don't waste my time with cliches. Tell me the truth, Sophie. All of it." Her gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment, I thought she might clam up entirely. But then she nodded, her voice steadier this time. "It started 6 months ago. Darren and I worked on a project together, something small at first. He was charming, attentive in ways I hadn't felt in a long time. And then, one night after a work dinner, he kissed me. I clenched my jaw, my hands curling into fists at my sides. The image of that man, Darren, kissing her, touching her, was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to stay silent, to let her continue. "I told myself it was just a mistake," she went on, her words coming faster now. "But then it happened again, and again. At first, it was just lunches, stolen moments. But then it became more." "More?" I echoed bitterly. "How much more, Sophie? Do you even know how many times you've betrayed me?" She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she admitted. "I lost count. I'm not proud of it. I hate myself for what I've done to you, to us." Her words stung, but they did little to soothe the ache in my chest. "And what about this trip?" I asked, my voice like ice. "Was this supposed to be your way of easing the guilt? Or was it just a convenient excuse to say goodbye before you ran off with him?" Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands. "I didn't want to leave you," she sobbed. I thought maybe this trip could help us, that it might remind me of why I fell in love with you in the first place." I laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made her flinch. "How generous of you, Sophie, to use me as a backup plan while you figured out if he was worth ruining everything for." "That's not fair," she cried, looking up at me with desperation in her eyes. "I was lost, okay? I didn't know what I wanted. I never stopped loving you. Don't," I warned, my voice sharp. "Don't you dare tell me you loved me while you were in another man's bed." She fell silent, her shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the shore. Finally, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to regain control. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less cutting. "You didn't just betray me, Sophie. You destroyed every ounce of trust we built together. Every memory, every promise. It's all tainted now." Her sobs quieted, and she looked up at me, her expression hollow. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered. "Tell me, and I'll do it. I'll do anything to fix this." I stared at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything, now a stranger sitting across from me. "You can't fix this," I said coldly, "but you can start by being honest. With me, with yourself, and with him." Her eyes widened in fear. "Darren?" "Yes," I said. "He's not going to get away with this, Sophie. Neither of you are." The color drained from her face, but she didn't argue. She nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," she whispered. "I'll tell him it's over. I'll end it." "Good," I said, standing. "But don't think for a second that this is forgiveness. This is just the beginning." As I walked away, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The pain was still there, raw and relentless, but so was a new resolve. Sophie had made her choice, and now it was my turn. Whatever came next, I would be ready, I spent the rest of the day in the villa, pacing the floor and replaying Sophie's confession in my mind. Her words had been raw, desperate, but they didn't erase the images burned into my head. Her laughter with Darren, the texts, the plans to leave me. If anything, her tears only deepened the betrayal. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. By late afternoon, Sophie had retreated to the guest room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. It was a strange, quiet limbo, a pause before the next move in a game neither of us wanted to play. But I wasn't about to sit idly by while Sophie tried to salvage whatever scraps were left of her lie. I needed to confront Darren again, but this time on my terms. His arrogance the previous night, the way he tried to justify his actions, had ignited something in me that I couldn't ignore. He thought he could waltz into my life and take what was mine. He was wrong. I pulled out my phone, opening Sophie's email once more. If they'd been bold enough to plan their meetings in writing, I figured there might be more breadcrumbs to follow. Sure enough, I found an email thread between Sophie and Darren discussing their future. My blood boiled as I scrolled through their plans, how they talked about moving in together, about Darren, taking care of her. Once she left me, one message stood out. Let's meet at the cafe by the marina tomorrow around 5. We need to talk next steps. Tomorrow. 5. My chance. The next day came with an air of inevitability. Sophie stayed out of my way, her silence deafening as I prepared for the meeting. I didn't tell her where I was going. She didn't ask. By the time I stepped out of the villa, the weight of my decision was heavy, but I welcomed it. Darren needed to understand what he'd done, what he'd set in motion. The cafe was busy when I arrived, a picturesque spot overlooking the harbor. I spotted Darren immediately, seated at a small table near the water, his phone in hand. He was dressed casually, sunglasses perched on his head, his posture relaxed as if he didn't have a care in the world. I approached quietly, my shadow falling over him before he even realized I was there. When he looked up, his smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of recognition, and then unease. "You," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Me," I replied, pulling out the chair across from him. I sat down, my gaze locked onto his. "We need to talk." Darren leaned back, his confidence quickly returning. "Look, if you're here to." "Save it." I cut him off, my voice low but firm. "I'm not here for excuses, and I'm not here to fight over her. I'm here to make one thing clear." He raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "And what's that?" "That you've made the biggest mistake of your life," I said, leaning forward. "You think you've won, that you've outsmarted me. But all you've done is show me who you really are, a selfish coward who preys on other people's lives." Darren's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I continued, my voice steady. "I've got everything. Your emails, your texts, even photos of the two of you. You've been sloppy, Darren, and I'm not afraid to use what I've got." His composure cracked slightly, a flicker of nervousness in his eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone less confident now. "I want you gone," I said. "Out of her life. Out of mine. And if I so much as hear your name again, I'll make sure every one of your little secrets becomes public knowledge. Your job, your reputation, your life as you know it, it'll all come crashing down." Darren stared at me, the weight of my words sinking in. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he nodded slowly, his bravado replaced by reluctant submission. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll back off." "Good," I said, standing. "Remember this moment, Darren. Remember that you didn't win. You'll always be the man who took someone else's scraps and lost everything in the process." I didn't wait for his reply. As I walked away, a strange sense of satisfaction settled over me. It wasn't justice, not entirely, but it was a start. Back at the villa, Sophie was waiting, her eyes searching mine as I stepped through the door. "Well?" she asked hesitantly. "It's done," I said simply, my voice void of emotion. "He's out." Relief washed over her face, but I didn't share her sentiment. This wasn't closure. This was the beginning of something new, a life where trust would never come easily again. The hours after my confrontation with Darren were a blur. Back at the villa, Sophie hovered, her expression wavering between guilt and gratitude. She was relieved, perhaps foolishly thinking that Darren's retreat meant we could repair what was left of us. But I wasn't there yet. If anything, the weight of everything we'd lost pressed down harder with every glance she stole at me. "Do you think we can start over?" she asked cautiously. I stared at her for a long moment, the question hanging heavily between us. "That depends," I said finally. "On you. On whether you're ready to face what you've done, and on whether I can find it in myself to forgive you." She nodded, her tears starting again. "I'll do whatever it takes." The words were sincere, but sincerity wasn't enough anymore. For now, I needed time, space, and clarity. We stayed the rest of the week at the villa, each day steeped in an uneasy quiet. Sophie tried to make small gestures, cooking my favorite meals, suggesting we explore the town together. But they felt hollow. The memories of her betrayal were too fresh, her laughter with Darren too vivid. One night, I wandered out to the pier alone. The water shimmered under the moonlight, the same spot where I'd first seen Sophie and Darren together. I leaned against the railing, my thoughts spiraling. Could I ever look at her the same way again? Or was I clinging to something that had already died? On the final day of the trip, Sophie approached me with an envelope in her hands. "I need you to see this," she said quietly, handing it to me. Inside were printed emails, messages from Darren. They weren't what I expected. They painted him as manipulative, pressuring Sophie to leave me, promising her the world while threatening to expose their affair if she didn't comply. "I'm not saying this excuses me," she said, her voice trembling, "but I need you to know it wasn't all what it seemed." The revelation stunned me. Darren wasn't just a charming intruder. He was a calculating predator. It didn't absolve Sophie, but it added a layer of complexity I hadn't been prepared for. When we returned home, reality hit harder than ever. The villa had been a bubble, but now we were back in the house where we'd built a life together. A life that felt irreparably fractured. I couldn't look at the photos on the walls without wondering how long they had been a lie. Sophie started therapy, both individual and couple sessions. I agreed to attend, though my skepticism lingered. Could trust be rebuilt when the foundation had crumbled so completely? Weeks turned into months, and while progress was slow, there were glimpses of hope. Sophie was open and honest in ways she hadn't been before, and I could see genuine remorse in her actions. But doubt lingered, and one night, in a moment of weakness, I logged into her email. What I found wasn't incriminating. There were no messages to Darren, no signs of betrayal. Instead, there were journal-like entries, confessions of guilt, prayers for forgiveness, and plans to prove her love to me. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it planted a seed of possibility. One day, I received a call from Darren. His voice was calm, almost smug. "I hope you know Sophie still thinks about me," he said. "You can kick me out of her life, but you'll never erase me." The audacity of his words reignited my fury. I was tempted to strike back, to unleash the evidence I had and destroy him professionally. But after hours of internal debate, I chose a different path. Darren thrived on chaos. I wouldn't feed it. Instead, I sent him a single text: "Stay away. You've already lost." Sophie and I stood at a crossroads, months of therapy and reflection leading us to a decision. Was our marriage worth saving, or were we prolonging the inevitable? One evening, over a quiet dinner, she looked at me with tear-filled eyes. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo, but if there's even a sliver of a chance, I want to fight for us. For you. For everything we had." Her words were raw, stripped of pretense. For the first time, I believed she truly meant them. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I admitted, "but I'm willing to try." It wasn't a happy ending, not in the traditional sense. The wounds were still fresh, the scars permanent, but it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain. Sophie continued therapy, and I began to let my walls down, brick by brick. We rebuilt slowly, piece by painful piece, knowing that some fractures might never heal completely. As for Darren, he disappeared from our lives, a ghost of a mistake that would forever haunt us. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and trust didn't come quickly. But in the quiet moments, when Sophie reached for my hand or whispered, "I love you," I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back.